Welcome to the deep dive. Here, we really take the sources that matter to you and, well, explore them with an intensity that leaves no stone unturned.
That's the idea.
Today, we're plunging headfirst into a really fascinating, and I think for many, quite a controversial text. Joseph de Maistre's On the Spanish Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
Our aim isn't just to, skim the surface. We're going to try and extract every single detail, every nuance from these pages.
And this is a particularly interesting dive, I think, because the study itself comes from Imperium Press's Studies in Reaction series.
Right.
So that immediately tells you something important about the perspective we're engaging with here. Reactionary thought, well, in this context, it generally looks back, often critically, at how the modern world developed.
So you're expecting a viewpoint that really challenges the sort of standard understanding.
Exactly. Expect that challenge.
Absolutely. And Joseph de Maistre himself, he wasn't just some academic commentator. He was an 18th, early 19th century Savoyard nobleman, lived through incredible upheaval.
Right, the French Revolution era and aftermath.
Exactly. And he wasn't just writing abstractly.
Yeah.
He had a real-world legal career, served the Sardinian court during, very turbulent times, held significant political posts later on.
And while his bigger political works like Considerations on France or the St. Petersburg Dialogues are reasonably well known, this specific analysis of the Inquisition often just flies under the radar. The publisher actually suggests that this relative obscurity might be partly due to sort of historical anti-Catholic biases.
That might have put off Protestant readers, maybe.
That's the suggestion, yeah. Discourage them from engaging with any defense, really, of Catholic institutions like the Inquisition.
And the letters themselves, the core of what we're looking at, were written in 1815. That's a crucial moment, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely pivotal. The Spanish Inquisition had actually been suppressed just a few years before by the revolutionary Cortes. And then it had just recently been reestablished. So Maistre's writing these letters to a Russian nobleman who, like many across Europe at the time, held really strong negative views about the Inquisition.
Prejudiced against it, basically.
Pretty much. And what makes Maistre's approach so interesting, I think, is his strategic use of evidence.
How so?
Well, to persuade his skeptical friend, he leans really heavily on the official reports and the proceedings of the very committee of the Cortes that had actually overseen the Inquisition's abolition just years before.
So he's using the words of its adversaries against them.
Precisely. These are, in effect, testimonies from the institution's former opponents, which, lends considerable weight to his counter-arguments. It's a clever rhetorical move.
And he structures this defense across 5 distinct letters, right? Each tackling different aspects of the Inquisition's reputation and history.
Exactly. The first letter really sets out to dismantle some fundamental misunderstandings. He argues, first, that the Inquisition wasn't simply an arm of the church. Second, that the religious figures involved didn't actually participate in handing down death sentences.
That's a big claim.
It is. Third, that it didn't condemn people just for their private beliefs, things they kept to themselves.
Right.
And fourth, crucially, that it was fundamentally a royal institution, operating directly under the authority of the Spanish monarch.
So the key takeaway there is Maistre immediately trying to shift the ground, establishing the king's authority over it, not the church's alone.
That's the foundation he builds. Then, the second letter confronts those deeply ingrained accusations of cruelty and severity.
The torture, the burnings.
All of that. Maistre provides what he sees as crucial historical context. He reminds his reader that, things like torture and burning were, unfortunately, pretty widespread practices in secular European courts at the time.
Not unique to the Inquisition.
Not at all, he argues. He then contends that the narratives of the Inquisition's specific cruelties have been significantly exaggerated over time. And furthermore, he emphasizes a point often overlooked, the role of the Catholic priests within the Inquisition.
What role was that?
He claims they actively sought clemency, advocating for more lenient punishments, even for people considered notoriously guilty by the secular authorities.
Interesting. So a mitigating influence.
That's his argument. Then, in the third letter, Maistre really turns his critical eye towards those often dramatic and, in his view, unreliable accounts given by travelers, especially English travelers.
Ah, the travelogues.
Exactly. He specifically targets a Reverend Mr. Townsend, rector of Pusey. Apparently, his 3-volume work, while maybe engagingly written, significantly contributed to that prevailing negative public image of the Inquisition. Maistre quite humorously analyzes Townsend's seemingly frightful tales, suggesting that if you look closely, they're little more than, well, his words were silly tales and cock and birth stories.
Okay, we'll definitely need to dig into some examples of those later.
Absolutely. Then the fourth letter shifts focus completely. It presents a rather unconventional argument that Spain actually benefited from having the Inquisition.
Benefited.
He posits that, unlike most other European nations, which were just ravaged by religious wars and internal conflict.
Right, the Reformation, the 30 Years' War.
Precisely. Spain enjoyed this remarkable period, nearly 3 centuries, characterized by order, unity, and relative tranquility. And Maistre directly attributes the sustained peace and stability to the influence and actions of the Inquisition.
So the core insight there is the Inquisition, controversial as it was the reason for Spain's long internal peace, unlike the rest of Europe.
That's his provocative claim. Finally, the fifth letter takes a direct look at England.
Okay.
Maistre argues that the core Protestant idea of individual private judgment in faith matters inevitably leads to a weakening of religious belief and ultimately to religious indifference.
So less conviction overall.
That's his view. And he goes further, contending that despite England's, much celebrated claims of liberty and religious toleration, its own history is just full of deep-seated intolerance and violent persecution, specifically aimed at Catholics.
Right, the penal laws and so on.
Exactly. He aims to show that England, therefore, has very little moral ground to stand on when criticizing Spain's Inquisition.
It's also important, I think, to keep in mind the publisher's stated aim for this series, Imperium Press.
Yes, good point. They say they want to present these, what they consider seminal works of reactionary thought in a format that's accessible but also concise.
With the goal of showing, quote, profound insights into the fundamental problems of modernity from that particular intellectual tradition.
Right. So we're getting a specific lens on modernity itself through Maistre.
Okay, let's begin this deep dive into the text itself then, starting with the preface the publisher provides. They emphasize that reactionary thought, at its best anyway, is known for its directness, its precision, using well-chosen words that kind of cut through the superficial stuff to identify core issues.
And propose what they see as elegant, lasting solutions to modern problems.
Right. So that sets the stage for how we should approach Maistre's work. We should be looking for these sharp, conciseful statements that try to cut through what he saw as the, muddled thinking of his era.
Absolutely. Moving into Maistre's introduction, he immediately makes a very clever, strategically important point. He highlights the official report from that philosophical Cortes of 1812.
The assembly that actually suppressed the Inquisition.
The very one. Maistre argues that this report, even though its clear goal was abolishing the tribunal, inadvertently offers powerful, unbiased proof in favor of the Inquisition's past necessity, maybe even its positive effects.
How does that work, using your opponent's report?
Well, the key is how Maistre subtly frames the Cortes. He describes it as an assembly that contrived to satisfy nobody but themselves.
Implying they weren't really legitimate or widely supported?
Exactly. So therefore, any acknowledgement, even a reluctant one, from that body against their own aims, like recognizing the Inquisition's former usefulness or the reasons for its founding, becomes incredibly significant evidence for Maistre.
Okay, that makes sense. Following that, Maistre tackles a really common misconception about the Inquisition's origins. One he blames on modern unbelievers, echoing what he sees as Protestant historical ignorance.
Yes, this is the idea that St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, also founded the Inquisition.
Right, you hear that a lot.
You do, and Maistre meticulously clarifies the timeline to debunk it. He points out the Inquisition's origins actually predate St. Dominic by decades. He locates its establishment at the Council of Verona, 1184.
Okay.
The Dominicans only got involved with the Inquisition starting around 1233. That's well over 10 years after St. Dominic himself had died.
So that distinction is crucial for Maistre. Why?
Because it directly refutes the idea that the Inquisition was just the brainchild of one, particularly zealous religious fetish. Instead, he frames it as a response to broader societal and religious threats.
Which leads him to provide the historical context for why it emerged in the first place. He focuses on the threat posed in the 12th century by the Manichaeans, or more commonly known as the Albigenses.
Right. He argues their beliefs and actions were a direct danger, not just to the Church's doctrines and authority, but also to the basic stability and peace of the secular state itself.
And Note B in the text goes into quite a bit of detail on their specific doctrines, doesn't it?
It really does. They had this dualistic theology, believed in two fundamental creators, and because of that, two distinct Christs. One good and invisible, the other evil, only appearing to die and rise.
Wow, okay.
They completely rejected the Christian belief in bodily resurrection, condemned the Church's sacraments like baptism and the Eucharist, even viewed matrimony negatively.
And procreation.
Considered it a crime, incredibly. Yeah. Their rejection of the established religious hierarchy was absolute, and they actively used violence to try and overthrow it.
Beyond the theology, he mentions their morals.
Yes, he describes their morals as infamous and abominable, basically indicating a complete breakdown of ethics as he saw it. He lists various names associated with them: Pifres, Paterns, Poplacolins, Cathari, showing these were widespread movements.
So fundamentally, they held some pretty radical beliefs that challenged both religion and society at the time. Maistre uses this to argue for a strong initial response.
Precisely. This widespread challenge led directly to the Albigensian Crusade, which was, a brutal and complex conflict.
And one that, as Maistre acknowledges, Protestant writers often used as Exhibit A for their criticisms of supposed Catholic violence and intolerance.
Right. Maistre does concede the possibility that Simon de Montfort, a key leader in that crusade, might have used excessive punishments sometimes.
But he contextualizes it.
Immediately. He frames those actions within what he describes as the Albigenses' own gross profanations of religion and their extreme cruelty towards Catholics. So it's crucial to see how Maistre is setting up the historical precedent here. The Inquisition as a necessary response to what was seen as an existential threat to both religious and civil order.
Okay, let's turn our focus now to Letter the First. Maistre kicks this off by firmly restating his core point. The Inquisition wasn't some rogue church operation.
No, it was, he says, demanded and established by the kings of Spain, acting under very difficult and extraordinary circumstances.
And crucially, he backs this up by citing the Cortes' own report.
Yes, page 37 of that very report. He's constantly underscoring the political origins, emphasizing it wasn't just a religious initiative from the clergy, but a deliberate response by the monarchy to specific pressing needs, maintaining order, national unity.
Then, following that assertion of royal authority, Maistre cleverly highlights the Cortes' own stated reason for eventually suppressing the Inquisition in 1812.
Right. Their official line was that changing circumstances in Spain meant the institution was no longer necessary.
Which is a significant concession from the very body that abolished it.
It is. They aren't necessarily condemning its entire past or original purpose, just arguing its function wasn't relevant anymore in early 19th century Spain.
Maistre then gets into a seemingly odd detail: the Inquisition's focus on genealogy, looking for Jewish or Mohammedan Muslim ancestry. Why was that so important?
He explains the rationale behind it. At the time the Inquisition was really established, he argues, these proscribed groups, even after official conversions or expulsions, often still had connections to powerful families and networks within Spain.
So they were still seen as a potential internal threat.
Exactly. A potential source of unrest or instability. Therefore, the constant threat of the anathema, that severe religious condemnation with real social and legal consequences linked to suspected adherence to Judaism or Islam, served as a kind of ongoing, prudent measure to keep these potential internal enemies subdued.
He suggests just arresting individuals wasn't enough.
Apparently not. A more pervasive form of social control was deemed necessary for long-term stability, according to his analysis of the situation.
Maistre then circles back to what he calls the three capital errors the public holds about the Inquisition. Can you remind us what those were?
Sure. First, that it was purely ecclesiastical, run solely by the church. Second, that the religious figures involved actually condemned people to death. And third, that it condemned people just for holding private opinions.
And Maistre says,
all three are completely false. He hammers home the purely and completely royal nature of the Inquisition. The King of Spain held ultimate authority, directly appointing the Inquisitor General,
who then nominated all the other inquisitors.
Right. A direct line of control, underscoring the monarch's power over it.
At this point, he directly tackles Voltaire's highly critical portrayal.
Yes, the very influential Enlightenment writer. Maistre quotes Voltaire's scathing description, bloody tribunal, frightful monument of monkish power, even includes the French verses.
And Maistre's counter.
He flatly rejects that image. He asserts, quite the opposite, that the Inquisition was the tribunal of a nation known for its wisdom, moderation, and honor. He stresses again its strictly royal character, that its judges were learned and capable clergy, that it judged real crimes based on public laws with equity and wisdom.
And crucially reputes that it never condemns anyone, however criminal, to death.
That's his key assertion.
He really doesn't hold back on Voltaire, does he? Calls him a base calumniator for painting these men who Maistre sees as merciful and moderate so negatively.
No, he definitely doesn't mince words. He suggests Voltaire's deep hatred of all authority, religious or secular, fueled his biased misrepresentations.
And he argues the public is easily swayed.
Yes, an ignorant and prejudiced public, he claims, is easily deceived by these sensational falsehoods. He even notes how these misconceptions can seep into the thinking of people who should know better, citing that example from the Journal de l'Empire.
What was that specific claim?
The absolutely bizarre assertion that inquisitors routinely burned people just for believing in God, and supposedly kept doing it until 1783.
Maistre then really picks apart that journal passage, right?
Right.
With rhetorical questions.
He does. He asks first, where on earth is there any tribunal that literally never condemns anyone to death, implying it's unheard of? Second, what crime does a civil court commit by executing someone based on state law? And third, he asks directly, show me the Spanish law that mandated death for deists, people who believed in God, but not organized religion.
So by asking these questions, he's highlighting the lack of any factual basis for these claims.
Exactly. And expressing surprise that the public could believe something so outlandish, like the idea that priests had the independent authority to sentence people to death.
This leads him right into that fundamental Catholic principle. The Church abhors blood.
Yes, ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. He explains this is so ingrained that priests are traditionally forbidden even from being surgeons.
Because it involves bloodshed?
Right. And they're often excused from witnessing capital trials in secular courts, or if they attend, it's often specifically to protest the sentence and plead for mercy.
He emphasizes they never build the scaffold.
Never. Their presence is only as martyrs themselves or as spiritual comforters, always preaching clemency and pity.
To contrast this negative image of the Spanish Inquisition, he points to historical examples.
He does. He points to the ecclesiastical states in Germany, where the common saying was, it is good to live under the crozier, the bishop's staff. Implying that rule by religious authorities was generally mild, peaceful, and notably didn't involve persecution or capital punishment for spiritual enemies.
And he uses Rome itself, the papal government, as the prime example.
As the absolute epitome of the priesthood's true character. He describes it as incontestably mild, paternalistic, impartial injustice, using gentle punishments, showing complete toleration.
And famously being a haven for Jewish people, the paradise of the Jews.
That's the phrase he uses, highlighting its reputation for tolerance.
And he gives that specific historical example of Pope Clement IV.
Yes, scolding St. Louis IX of France for his overly severe laws against blasphemers. That was in a papal bull from July 12, 1268. Clement urged moderation and advised the King of Navarre not to copy the French king's harshness.
So, Maistre then really hammers home the need to distinguish between the actions of the state and the conduct of the Church when analyzing the Inquisition.
Critically important distinction for him. He firmly asserts that any rigorous aspects, especially the death penalty, were purely the responsibility of the civil government in Spain.
The Church's role, he argues, was consistently one of clemency.
Yes. Often actively intervening to suppress or at least mitigate the severity of punishments handed down by secular courts.
He goes so far as to call it an error and a crime to believe priests could pronounce a death sentence.
Absolutely unequivocal on that point. He brings up the Knights Templar in France again.
Right, they asked to be tried by the Inquisition.
Precisely because they knew it wouldn't lead to a death sentence. But their request was ignored, and they were hastily condemned to death by the French king and his Council of State. Maistre notes this significant fact is often overlooked.
He then talks about the early Inquisition, saying punishments were initially limited.
Yes, largely to confiscating property. And even that could be reversed if the person recanted within the term of grace, citing the Cortes report again.
And the eventual imposition of the death penalty.
He says it's unclear exactly when that started, but argues it could only have been acquired as the Inquisition evolved into a royal institution, with the priesthood having no part in gaining or using that power. He also notes that even in modern times, relatively minor things like an arrest sentence required approval from the Supreme Council, implying careful procedure.
So if someone was accused of heresy and found guilty by the Inquisition,
The procedure was The tribunal confiscates their property, then hands the accused over to the secular arm, the Council of Castile, for legal punishment according to Spanish civil law.
And he describes the Council of Castile positively.
Yes, as enlightened, learned, and impartial, ensuring some fairness in the subsequent process.
But what if the evidence wasn't clear-cut? Or the person wasn't seen as stubbornly heretical?
Then the punishment was often much lighter. Typically a simple public abjuration, or recantation in church with certain rituals.
Which carried social stigma, presumably.
Undoubtedly. Some disgrace, maybe inability to hold public office. But Maistre himself speculates this seeming leniency might sometimes have been a tactic to quietly shield powerful criminals from worse secular penalties.
He then gives that detailed breakdown of who was actually on an Inquisition tribunal.
Right. At the top, the Grand Inquisitor, always an archbishop or bishop. Then 8 ecclesiastical counselors, 6 secular priests, 2 regulars, 1 Dominican by privilege, 1 from another order. The youngest secular counselor acted as attorney general. And sometimes, especially in potential capital cases, 2 counselors from the secular Council of Castile were brought in.
And Maistre uses this composition to refute Voltaire.
Directly. He argues this setup, just 2 monks alongside 11 or 13 mostly secular judges, hardly fits Voltaire's image of a bloody and frightful monument of monkish power. He defends the Dominicans against the common blame, too.
He goes on to argue that given the Catholic priesthood's emphasis on mercy, it's hard to imagine a court better designed to prevent cruelty.
That's his perspective. He believes the very spirit of the priesthood ensures mercy would hold sway. Plus, he adds, beyond the formal structure, there were countless particular mitigations benefiting the accused, known through practical experience.
He gives a sample severe sentence the Inquisition could issue, short of death.
Yes. Declaring someone an obstinate heretic, encourager of heretics, false confessor, relapsed impenitent. This meant excommunication and property confiscation. Then, crucially, the accused is left to justice and to the secular arm.
But with a strong plea from the Inquisition for kindness and compassion.
Exactly. That plea is key to his argument.
He then tackles the author of the Inquisition Unmasked, who claimed that mercy was just a meaningless formality.
Right. Maistre acknowledges that view, shared by the legal scholar Ben Espin, but sticks to his main point. The Inquisition never condemned anyone to death itself. No priest's name on an execution warrant.
So if Spanish civil law dictated death, the civil courts carried it out if the Inquisition found guilt.
But the tribunal itself had no part in the execution. That's his firm line.
He mentions that historical incident with Pope Leo X in Aragon in 1519.
Yes, a concession from the Pope regarding petitions on this subject, which Maistre sees as showing the Church's spirit of clemency. Though he notes King Charles V opposed the papal bulls, and Leo eventually approved Charles's stance in 1520, possibly just to avoid conflict with the powerful king.
So Maistre wraps up this first letter by basically saying the common public ideas about the Inquisition are groundless.
Entirely groundless, based on misinformation. He insists the negative accounts by infidel and Protestant writers are unjust when you look at the institution's actual character and the historical facts as he presents them.
Okay, let's move to the notes and illustrations for that first letter. Note, A focuses on what Maistre sees as Protestant writers' injustice towards Catholicism.
Yes. He argues this Protestant bias is actually the primary source of the hostility shown by infidel writers towards Catholicism. It's an interesting claim, blaming Protestantism for infidelity's attacks on the Church.
He calls this injustice la fable convenue, like an agreed-upon fiction, especially in England.
Exactly. A matter of course. He quotes that famous line about England being the nation easiest to deceive, the most difficult to undeceive, and the most powerful in deceiving others.
Strong words. He cites Cobbett, too.
Yes. Cobbett's belief that English books contain more lies than all others combined. Maistre argues almost every English antagonist systematically misrepresents, distorts, insults, and vilifies Catholic tenets, leading to that deep, ingrained hostility towards popery.
And he identifies other causes for this anti-Catholic feeling in England.
Several. First, the historical pattern. Groups breaking away from a parent church often become its bitterest enemies. Second, he argues that newly triumphant sects, like Protestantism in England, had a vested interest in keeping their gains land power by actively suppressing the Catholic Church. He calls this the very instinct of injustice.
He quotes Parnell's historical apology.
To back this up, Parnell described the English government deliberately keeping prejudices alive, reviving old libels, inventing new ones, circulating slander against Catholics, all to maintain power.
Maistre then makes that provocative point about the word Protestant itself.
Yeah, arguing it's not really the name of a religion, but more a term of hostility against Catholicism. He suggests even atheists could be called Protestants in their opposition.
And his conclusion for Note A.
That because of all these factors, England displays an unparalleled spirit of ill will and bigotry towards the Catholic Church compared to other Protestant states. He quotes Gibbon calling the English the most credulous and fanatic nation in Europe. Maistre laments the sheer scale of falsehoods and insults used to mislead the English public about Catholicism, ending on that rather dark note, suggesting these detractors might revert to past persecutions if they could.
Note C then shifts dramatically, urging a comparison between the Spanish Inquisition and England's own High Court of Commission under Queen Elizabeth I. He uses Hume's account.
Right, and the powers he describes for the High Commissioners are sweeping. Any three of them could punish anything tending towards heresy, schism, or sedition.
And they were the sole judges of that tendency.
Yeah, they alone decided. They could proceed based on mere rumor, suspicion, even personal fancy, and they could force people to incriminate themselves with an oath refusing meant prison.
So Maistre basically says this was an inquisitorial tribunal.
Absolutely. With all its terrors and iniquities, wielding full, unchecked discretionary power over everything. Inquiry, trial, sentence, penalty.
He adds details from Maclean's notes on Mosheim, too.
To really drive the point home, highlighting the court's power to inquire not just legally, but through the rack, torture, imprisonment, inquisition, fines and imprisonment limited only by the court's own whim.
Okay. Note D then returns to the idea of exaggerated accounts of the Spanish Inquisition, particularly by Protestant writers.
Yes, Maistre asserts any unbiased, learned person would agree these writers grossly exaggerate, often resorting to bigotry and inventing malicious lies out of ill will.
He points out that even critics like Voltaire and Montesquieu admitted this.
That's right. Admitted its enemies attributed countless guiltless cruelties and excesses to it. Voltaire even accused some of forging false tales just to inflame public opinion.
Maistre then makes that striking claim about the Inquisition in papal lands.
Yes, that in the papal dominions, the Inquisition was actually the most lenient of courts, far more so than English ecclesiastical courts. Claiming the Roman Inquisition hadn't condemned anyone to death in over a century.
He clarifies Pope Alexander VI didn't fully adopt Torquemada's plans.
Right, distancing the papacy somewhat from the most infamous inquisitor. And even in Spain, where it had its harshest reputation, he argues the death penalty was relatively rare.
He cites Limborch's list,
showing only 15 men and 4 women executed over a long period. While acknowledging that's still too many, he stresses these were for crimes like sacrilege, profanation, treason, witchcraft, things punishable by death across Europe then.
And he repeats his key point about who ordained these executions.
Always the civil power linked to the tribunal, not the spiritual authority of the inquisitors themselves. He concludes the note by firmly stating neither the Inquisition's founding nor its punishments relate to core Catholic faith or discipline. He lists many Catholic states that rejected it or viewed it with aversion, showing it wasn't universally accepted even within Catholicism.
Okay, let's move to the second letter. Here, Maistre tackles the second big false assumption, as he sees it.
Right. The idea that the Inquisition condemned people simply for their private opinions, the extreme example being a Jew burned just for being Jewish. Maistre deeply regrets that such a preposterous tale is so widely believed.
And he specifically calls out Montesquieu here.
Yes, expressing real disappointment to find the esteemed Montesquieu among the least excusable calumniators. He slams Montesquieu's attack based on that pretended remonstrance of a pretended Jewess in the spirit of the laws.
Maistre finds the very idea horrific.
Absolutely. Burning an innocent girl for her religion in a European capital, he calls it a national crime, a deep disgrace. He says Montesquieu's whole story is just a pitiful calumny, shameful only to its inventor.
He then questions the ethics of this kind of historical criticism,
posing that fundamental question: what justifies slandering nations and institutions with tales of atrocious tyranny without proof, especially when it contradicts known evidence?
Maistre then makes a key claim about how the Inquisition actually operated.
Yes, stating that in Spain and Portugal and elsewhere, people who just kept quiet about their beliefs, didn't publicly challenge things, were generally left alone.
So it was only the activists, the public dissenters,
only the imprudent enthusiasts who dogmatized publicly, disturbed public order, who had only themselves to blame if they were checked by authorities.
He defends the government's right to impose restraints.
argues every well-regulated government has to impose some limits on attempts to overturn the established religion for social cohesion. He says the Spanish kings had the right to set punishments for offenses based on their understanding of national needs and enemies.
He stresses the legal framework again.
The incontestable point for him: no one was punished except under universal, well-known laws, according to established justice forms, by lawfully constituted judges appointed and controlled by the king.
So his conclusion is that the denunciations are ill-founded.
Largely ill-founded, yes. And that Spaniards of his time had little real reason to complain, given this context.
He acknowledges people naturally dislike being judged by others.
Because we know humans are fallible. But he stresses submission to law is necessary for public peace. The enlightened legislative will is the best rule we have.
Applying this to Spain, if Spanish law punished declared enemies of religion with exile, prison, or death,
Then neither the criminal nor anyone else should complain, Maistre argues. The criminal could always have avoided punishment by just holding their tongue.
what about the treatment of Jews specifically?
He repeats his earlier point. The Inquisition mainly punished those who relapsed after converting to Christianity, or who actively preached Judaism. He admits laws were stricter against them, but says the remedy was always available: leave the country. By staying, they knowingly took the risk. No one can complain about a law equally applied to that category.
Then he addresses the outcry over torture and burning for religious crimes, especially from French infidel writers.
Right. He argues the inquisitors didn't invent torture. They used it under existing Spanish law, just like all other national tribunals did then. He points out torture had ancient precedents: Greece, Rome, even Athens.
He avoids judging the wisdom of torture itself.
Deliberately. But emphasizes, since it wasn't unique to the Inquisition, it's unjust to single it out for cruelty. Blame the princes who established those laws, he says, referencing Note A.
He brings up that detail from the Cortes report again, page 63.
Yes, indicating that not just inquisitors, but also bishops or their delegates had to be present during torture. Maistre reads this as implying attention and charity were expected even then.
He also stresses that torture sentences needed approval from the Supreme Council.
Just like any significant decree, even a simple arrest. So, torture in the Inquisition wasn't arbitrary, he argues, but accompanied by every possible legal precaution of the time.
So his final point on torture is,
If the King of Spain abolished it, like France, England, Sardinia did, that would be wise, and inquisitors would likely applaud. But it's unreasonable to reproach them for using a formally universal practice.
okay, let's look at Note A to the second letter. This provides a stark contrast, detailing torture under Queen Elizabeth I in England, using Mr. Jardine's account.
Yes, it's quite disturbing. Jardine describes horrific prison conditions. Cells below high water mark, totally dark, infested with rats from the Thames.
Rats attacking prisoners.
Documented instances of flesh being torn from sleeping prisoners by rats.
The note also mentions denial of food.
Citing Anthony Wood's account of Father Brian, starved for 2 days and nights, driven to eating clay and drinking roof drippings, then further tormented with needles, racking, and finally, a cruel death.
And the gentler method.
Tying thumbs together and suspending the accused by them from a beam. Excruciating. These details really highlight the brutality present in the English system at the same time.
Right. Let's move to letter the fourth. Maistre shifts his approach here, starting with a concept from science.
Yes, mean quantities. He draws an analogy to politics, arguing the best institutions ensure the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number over the longest time, mean happiness.
And he uses this principle to construct a hypothetical defense of the Inquisition.
Exactly. Imagining a Spaniard debating its bitterest enemy.
What's the Spaniard's argument?
That 16th century legislators saw Europe descending into chaos, in flames, and used the Inquisition as a political tool to preserve religious unity in Spain and prevent the kind of religious wars tearing other nations apart. A goal, the Spaniard argues, their accusers failed to achieve.
The Spaniard lists historical examples.
Oh, yes. The 30 Years' War, from Luther's doctrines, Anabaptist excesses, civil wars in France, England, Holland, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Marnandal, Cevennes, the assassinations of Mary Stuart, Henry IV, Charles I, Prince of Orange, emphasizes the ocean of blood shed by these innovators.
The claim being the Inquisition would have prevented this in Spain.
By punishing these public disturbers, yes, it would have kept the peace, unlike elsewhere.
Maistre then addresses that point from the Cortes Committee reporter again, denying the Inquisition's influence.
Right. The reporter claimed the bishop's authority alone would have been enough to handle heresy.
How does Maistre counter that?
He reminds us of his point from Letter 2. The bishops themselves saw inquisitors as faithful allies in preserving faith purity. But even if you grant the committee's point, he argues if bishops' authority was sufficient, then the Inquisition's authority, which took over from bishops but was arguably stronger, must have been even more useful to Spain. After all, modern heresies never got a foothold there.
He uses logic to corner them.
Pretty much. He says something must have prevented these heresies in Spain. If it wasn't bishops, power taken, and wasn't the Inquisition itself, says the committee, and wasn't civil courts, no jurisdiction, then what was this magic, all-sufficient instrument? He suggests the committee willfully ignored the obvious answer, the Inquisition's power.
He then points out the contrast again. Nearly every other European nation did have religious turmoil, except Spain and those using the Inquisition.
Therefore, he argues, it's logical to attribute Spain's peace solely to the Inquisition, as no other cause seems plausible.
He uses that analogy of the plague.
Yes, if one nation alone escaped a plague using a long-used prophylactic, it'd be unreasonable to deny the remedy worked just because other remedies might have worked elsewhere, where they didn't actually prevent the plague. Spain used the Inquisition remedy and avoided the religious war plague.
Maistre then argues the Inquisition shaped the Spanish character itself.
Profoundly, crediting it solely with preserving their maxims, faith unity, public spirit. He contrasts this very negatively with the miserable host formed by modern philosophy, who he says only brought evil, promoted tyranny, preached timidity, and will ruin Spain if it perishes.
He challenges the idea that the Cortes saved Spain recently.
Strongly disputes it, argues the people saved Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, acting despite the Cortes, led by national ideas and what others called superstition, meaning their traditional Catholic faith.
And extinguishing that faith would be disastrous.
Would lead to cold hearts, unfeeling individuals, egotism replacing patriotism in his view.
He defends the Spanish people against the superstition label.
Vigorously. Says they're the least known and most calumniated people in Europe. Argues the proverb is groundless. Higher orders are well-educated, enlightened. Lower classes' veneration of saints might sometimes exceed wise devotion, but dogma isn't violated, and these trifling abuses have advantages.
He even claims Spaniards have less prejudice and superstition than their mockers.
He does, citing examples common elsewhere. Amulets, apparitions, sympathetic remedies, dreams, fortune-tellers, unlucky numbers, spilling salt, unlucky travel days. Says these are rare in Spain because real religious principle opposes such fancies.
Yet despite all this, English writers keep attacking the Inquisition, and even British ministers opposed its reestablishment.
Maistre notes this with frustration. He concludes the letter saying he personally can't find anything detestable in the institution viewed in context, and promises the next letter will show why the English have the least right to reproach Spain.
Okay, note A to the fourth letter. This reinforces the idea that persecution is not a Catholic tenet.
Right. Reiterates the Inquisition was political, run by the monarchy. While it sometimes resulted in the death penalty for heretics, the spiritual members, priests, bishops, didn't pass or concur in those sentences. Their role: examine allegations, declare if opinions were heretical. Punishment was the civil power's business.
He blames English writers for misrepresenting this.
Yes. Says because churchmen were involved, English writers unjustly blame them for all alleged cruelties and claim persecution is a Catholic tenet. Says this accusation is in almost every anti-Catholic work spread by well-paid fanatics.
Maistre asserts persecution actually violates Catholic maxims.
Absolutely. Says the Church positively disclaims any right or power to punish heretics with death, citing Tertullian. It belongs not to religion to force religion.
He mentions canon law's aversion to bloodshed.
So versed that anyone concurring in death or mutilation, even in just war or judicial process, can't hold holy orders. Underscores the moral opposition to clergy involvement in capital punishment. So, ecclesiastical judges declaring heresy stated their authority ended there. Cites Jan Hus at Constance again, Church condemned his theology, secular power executed him.
He describes the Church's spirit in the Middle Ages when its power peaked.
Condemning heresies, excommunicating authors, but not typically inflicting death or corporal punishment. Less examples: Felix Dergel, Godescalc, Berengarius, Abelard, Marsilius of Padua, Wycliffe, all condemned theologically, not executed by the Church.
He uses O'Driscoll's History of Ireland as a key example.
Very compelling case for him. O'Driscoll noted no penal code against Protestantism during Catholic predominance in Ireland under Mary Sir Charles II and James II, calls it a singular instance of moderation and Catholicity, contrasting it with Protestant rule in Ireland, which was prescription intolerance. says Irish Catholics regaining power didn't persecute Protestants,
He also quotes Parnell on Mary the Star's reign in Ireland.
noting its general toleration, even sheltering English Protestants, calls Irish Catholics the only sect that ever resumed power without exercising vengeance, and Mary's Irish reign unstained by holy persecution.
He's careful to distinguish Mary's actions in England, though.
Yes, clarifies that while Mary did persecute in England, actions Catholics condemned, she didn't do it based on Catholic tenets. Papal instructions didn't urge severity. Burnet notes Cardinal Pole's synod didn't recommend harshness. Collier notes bishops in King Philip's confessor opposed sanguinary methods.
And even Bonner and Gardner, blamed for cruelty, didn't cite doctrine.
Cited only policy and necessity, Maistre says. He also lists extenuating circumstances for their conduct in England: constant insults, danger to clergy, rebellious Protestant faction, Jane Grey conspiracy, Wyatt's rebellion, attempts on Mary's life, seditious publications. Says these justified prudence, maybe, but not persecution. Notes Cranmer was burned under laws he enacted against Anabaptists.
Maistre then tackles the main argument Protestant writers use, the third canon of the Fourth Lateran Council.
Right, the one always cited about persecuting heretics. Maistre offers two critical responses. First, questions if it's truly the Council's act, citing Dupin, who attributes it to Pope Innocent III alone.
Second,
Cites Collier, arguing the canon isn't genuine or authoritative at all.
but even if it were genuine,
Maistre argues it was never defined or proposed as a tenet of Catholic faith, just external discipline for a specific occasion. Like many disciplinary canons from Trent, not articles of faith, not universally accepted. He says the Lateran canon was never seen as a core tenet by Catholics and is now a dead letter, as the circumstances of the Albigensian threat are long gone.
he emphasizes the nature of the Fourth Lateran Council itself.
Not just ecclesiastical, but a council or congress of the Christian world, temporal and clerical leaders, kings, emperors present or represented, aimed at stopping the Albigensian heresy, whose principles, even Protestant historians like Mosheim agreed, were destructive to morality, piety, and society. So the cause was human nature as much as Christianity, and the decrees only applied where Albigenses were active; elsewhere they weren't executed or molested.
Having argued persecution isn't Catholic, he then boldly claims it's a Protestant tenet.
Yes, turning the tables completely. He cites Luther's savage calls for persecution, comparing his language to Marat and Robespierre, advocating attacks on popes, cardinals, washing our hands in their blood.
Quotes Zwingli, too.
Evangelium vult sanguinem, the gospel wills blood, calls this the motto for the first Protestant leaders, all defenders of persecution in theory and practice. Even Melanchthon wrote a book defending it.
He brings up Cranmer again.
His similar doctrines and his execution of victims. Von Paris, Nell, and Askew, others burned. Also the persecutions by Latimer and Ridley.
Later examples in England.
Under Elizabeth, Bishop Sandys wrote defending persecution. Dissenters blamed bishops like Parker, Aylmer, Sandys, Whitgift for their persecutions.
Under James I.
Parliament urged persecution for God's glory. Archbishop Abbott told James tolerating Catholics would bring God's wrath.
Charles the Thurston II.
Parliaments constantly urged persecuting Catholics. Archbishop Usher called tolerating papists a grievous sin. Maistre says this spirit defined the state and clergy under every Protestant reign until George III, with more laws and public bigotry applauding them.
Then he turns to Scotland and John Knox.
Describes Knox and his allies savagely teaching persecution of Catholics as a holy and sacred duty. Knox argued people were bound to kill Queen Mary and her priests. In 1560, Scottish Parliament decreed death for all Catholics as idolaters, a religious obligation. Robertson noted the indecent haste of reformers escaping tyranny only to imitate it.
His sweeping conclusion about Protestantism.
Based on history, not a single Protestant state or town, once in power, didn't persecute and refuse toleration to Catholics. He quotes Rousseau. The Reformation was intolerant from its cradle, and its founders were, all of them, a set of persecutors. Bayle and Jurieu agreed. Rousseau added Protestantism is the most intolerant and inconsistent sect, intolerant without knowing why.
Maistre finds this hypocritical.
Utterly. If liberty of conscience is Protestantism's basis, how can they deny it to Catholics?
Okay, deep breath. Let's move into the fifth letter. Maistre starts with a principle of good governance.
Yes, the surest way for a sovereign to get obedience and prevent unrest is to act with justice and wisdom, promoting true religion and sound morality. When these are neglected, neither vigilance nor rigor can ensure security, a secret, he says, which will not easily be discovered by those relying only on force.
From this principle, he turns directly to England, the boasted land of liberty.
Yes, examining its own conduct regarding its established church and treatment of minorities, especially Catholics.
He cites Hume again, reporting England's Inquisition against Catholics.
Hume argued it was more terrible than Spain's because it had the same tyranny without the order and forms. The whole tyranny of the Inquisition was introduced into the kingdom.
Maistre details some harsh Elizabethan laws.
Returning to Catholicism or reconciling anyone to it was high treason. Refusing Protestant service for a month, if over 16, meant prison. Relapsing meant permanent banishment. Returning, even to see family, meant hanging as a traitor.
He mentions Father Campion again.
Renowned Jesuit, executed simply for being a priest and comforter. Falsely accused of conspiracy, tortured so cruelly on the rack the jailer remarked he'd soon be half a foot longer. Walpole similarly tried, racked, executed, refusing pardon if it meant acknowledging the Queen's supremacy.
He highlights the frightful cruelties in Ireland under Elizabeth.
Deemed inexcusable even by the Edinburgh reviewers, cites that manuscript letter from Officer Lee in Dublin describing horrors worse than a Turkish province. Even Camden noted Elizabeth didn't believe most condemned priests were guilty of any crime against the state.
Maistre's conclusion on the penal laws.
A system of oppression, cruelty, injustice unparalleled in history. Burke's quote again. A system as well fitted for the debasement of human nature itself, violating every principle. More details in Note B.
He includes that strange, grim detail from Francis Bacon.
Yes, the magic ointment kneading moss from an unburied human skull. And Bacon's casual note it could be found in great plenty, in Ireland, upon the carcasses which are thrown there, in heaps, upon the dunghills. Maistre uses this to underscore the brutality and disregard for life in Ireland.
He then points out that ironic English law, the king forfeits the crown if he becomes Catholic.
Calls it a very strange law. Highlights the contradiction. Parliament can dethrone the best monarch for becoming Catholic, but a Catholic king couldn't expel the meanest subject for becoming Protestant. Shows nations falling into self-contradictions.
He anticipates the English argument about the king not controlling consciences.
And asks, how then did Henry VIII and Elizabeth have more authority over consciences? And how was resistance to them justified by Protestant theology if the king can't dictate religion?
He expects the reply, oh, the cases are very different. His take on the difference.
Simply that opponents of Henry and Elizabeth defended 16 centuries of tradition, while the current Protestant establishment is the offspring of yesterday.
So his powerful conclusion to this letter.
The English are perhaps the last people with any right to reproach Spain. England, despite its means, gave itself to horror and excess, murdered one king, expelled another through fanaticism, before finding tranquility. How can any reasonable person condemn Spain's detestable Inquisition, knowing Spain alone navigated 2 centuries of delirium with wisdom even Voltaire admired?
He quotes Voltaire's maxim about glass houses.
When a man's house is made of glass, he should be careful not to throw stones at the house of his neighbor. Applies it directly to England.
He addresses the counter-argument. England's convulsions ceased, its present greatness inspires envy.
His reply, no one is obliged or permitted to buy uncertain future happiness with great present misfortunes. A sovereign doing so is criminal. Kings of Spain wisely prevented torrents of pure blood by spilling a few drops of impure. They don't deserve constant reproach.
And a second, sharper reply.
England's present state cost not only blood but the loss of faith. England only ceased persecution when she ceased to believe wonder this, which cannot well be boasted of. The prevailing spirit now is indifferentism.
Okay, Note A to the 5th letter summarizes the English penal laws against Catholics.
Argues a candid comparison shows English laws were more severe, unjust, and more frequently and distressingly executed than what's reproached in the Inquisition. The English Protestant, he claims, was a greater persecutor than the Spanish Catholic.
He cites Burke again on these laws.
Calling them unmatched even by Nero's codes in injustice, inhumanity, oppression, a system for the debasement of human nature itself, violating every principle.
He lists examples of these numerous laws.
Treason 4. Refusing oath of supremacy, maintaining Pope's spiritual power, giving, receiving absolution, reconciling to Catholicism, receiving holy orders overseas, punishment, hanging, drawing, quartering alive.
Felony examples.
Receiving, concealing a priest, returning from banishment, leaving kingdom without oath of allegiance. Prémunire for absurd acts like receiving a crucifix or beads, plus numerous laws based on mere suspicion.
The overall impact.
Excluding Catholics from almost all professions, public office, disabling inheritance or land purchase, ruining families, rewarding informers, preventing Catholic education, heavy fines for not attending Protestant service, confinement in your home, etc., aimed at total annihilation of Catholicism in England and Ireland. His comparison. Inquisition accused of severity, but English laws went further in scope and injustice, targeting basic existence and rights.
Note B gives grim statistics and details on Elizabethan persecutions using Sydney Smith.
Smith cited 204 Catholic deaths under Elizabeth, 142 priests, 3 ladies, rest gentlemen, yeomen. 90 more died in prison, 105 banished with total property loss, fines, forfeitures, impoverished multitudes.
Describes the execution method again.
Hanging, cut down alive, dismembered, bowels ripped out and burnt before their faces, then beheaded and quartered. Process sometimes over half an hour. Notes, only 11 victims were even accused of any pretended plot. Camden admitted they were political victims.
More examples of barbarity.
Father Southwell racked 10 times. Mrs. Ward hanged, drawn, quartered for helping a priest escape. Mrs. Lyne, same for harboring one. Mrs. Clitheroe pressed to death for relieving a priest, sharp stone under her back.
Cardinal Allen's account
Recounts even more disgusting methods. Innocent virgins put with strumpets for corruption, children taken for Protestant instructors, priests' ears burnt cut off, cruel whippings, calls them unspeakable horrors not inferior to any of the pagan persecutions. Bridgewater counted 1,200 Catholic victims dead from persecution before 1588.
The York Castle incident.
Smith mentions 50 gentlemen imprisoned one night, most dying from vermin, famine, thirst, damp, dirt, fever, whipping, broken hearts. Forcibly dragged weekly to chapel for Protestant service for a year. Catholics frequently tortured dreadfully. Maistre's conclusion stands: no nation less right to reproach Spain than England. Historically, far more Catholics suffered under Elizabeth than Protestants under Mary.
Note C offers Count Pollnitz's view on the Roman Inquisition's mildness.
Yes, Pollnitz, writing to a Protestant friend, says he found it no more formidable than any other court for honest people. Claims thousands of false tales told by Protestants.
His advice:
live quietly, speak respectfully of God's saints, or don't insult, avoid public scandal, and you have nothing to fear from the Holy Office in Rome. He asks, where is the barbarity? Finds it the mildest, most lenient tribunal.
His example:
someone speaking against religion gets absolution from the Father Commissioner after confessing, repenting, acknowledging errors, with just an exhortation to change. Asks where a Protestant tribunal would be satisfied with confession instead of prison or death. Pollnitz spent 16 months in Rome, never heard of anyone arrested by Inquisition, witnessed acts of clemency not found elsewhere.
Finally, Note D critically analyzes Reverend Mr. Townsend's account of the Spanish Inquisition.
Maistre admits Townsend's work is clever and well-written, but argues it heavily contributed to the public's negative faith and terror regarding the Inquisition.
He dissects Townsend's claim about the Inquisition citing anyone and seizing people from bed.
If Townsend means witnesses, Maistre says it shows ignorance. All governments summon necessary witnesses. If he means the accused, why shouldn't they be cited or arrested? Strange to exempt anyone from jurisdiction.
Maistre finds Townsend's outrage about night arrests ridiculous.
Particularly ridiculous. Asks if England doesn't arrest capital crime suspects at night. If so, so much the worse for England. And why should Spain respect villains' sleep?
He mocks Townsend's account of that 1764 auto de fe in Madrid,
where the infamous criminal was supposedly sentenced to eat biscuits and drink wine through the streets, mocks the portrayal of the Grand Inquisitor's mild address about lenity and reform, urging sorrow from guilt, not disgrace.
The target of Maistre's sarcasm.
Townsend's description of the horrible cruelty of the nobility and court ladies being invited to a grand feast afterwards by the Marquise de Cogoludo for the judges and officers, Maistre finds the horrified reaction absurd.
He critiques Townsend's reflection that this made the tribunal contemptible.
Sarcastically highlights Townsend's elements: admirable alliance of legal severity with Christian charity, compassion of the public, clemency of the judges, paternal address, condemnation as exhortation to reform, punishment turned into a feast of mercy. Questions the sense of a traveler condemning a nation's jurisprudence while recommending secret punishments.
Poses that rhetorical question about secret flogging.
wouldn't Townsend have loudly inveighed against that, with engravings of brutal executioners and pious Dominicans in dungeons? Suggests Townsend's outrage is selective.
Maistre concludes Townsend was insolent.
Yes, for a mere stranger to judge what a great Spanish tribunal should publish or conceal, without knowing the details or why publicity might be needed. Spanish tribunals, like others, are best judges. Concludes Townsend's other reproaches are likely equally groundless.
Okay, now the third letter. Maistre starts by challenging the term victims of the Inquisition.
Argues there are no more victims than any other criminals legally executed. Emphasizes the Inquisition only hands people over to civil power at the last extremity after every effort to reclaim them, referencing Histe Charlemagne.
He then introduces the concept of equity.
Defined by a great mind as the remedy invented for those cases in which the law, on account of its universality, is deficient. Human laws are general, inherently partially unjust sometimes. Exceptions are as just as the rule in those cases. Without dispensation, exception, mitigation, violation, and abuse must occur. Conscience allows exceptions, but passions generalize them to defeat the law.
In criminal matters, equity power usually rests with the sovereign.
Pardons, commutation, lettre de cachet, etc. But Maistre warns sovereign interference in justice administration is most dangerous, not questioning the right to pardon, but urging prudent use.
He then proposes a better place for mitigations, especially for religious moral crimes.
Not full pardon, but undefined mitigations, better vested in an enlightened tribunal, essentially royal, but also sacerdotal in its judge's quality.
What's more reasonable than introducing the oil of mercy into criminal justice? He sees the Inquisition formed for this service.
Precisely. He gives the example of that infamous woman in Madrid.
The one who faked piety while living immorally, even deceived a bishop.
Yes. Her apartment discovered as a scene of criminal disorders. The Inquisition had a chance for a magnificent auto da fe, but justice yielded to mercy. Woman dealt with quietly, accomplice monk punished without death, unsuspecting prelate's reputation shielded, an example of discretion and mercy over spectacle.
The second example, the Cuestas brothers.
Ecclesiastics who displeased a court favorite, handed to Inquisition on fabricated charges, backed by invincible influence, ingenuity used to ruin them.
But the Inquisition.
The Inquisitor of Valladolid discovered the conspiracy. Overcoming authority and seductions, declared the brothers innocent. Shows Inquisition's justice even against powerful interests.
Maistre's conclusion from these examples.
They illustrate how the Inquisition serves as a court of equity, mitigating law's rigor with prudence and knowledge of circumstances, a power best placed in such a tribunal combining royal authority with priestly character.
Note D to the third letter continues Count Paulnitz's defense of the Roman Inquisition's mildness.
Reiterates its leniency, citing Galileo's case only imprisoned a few days.
And the Jesuit Cassandri.
Convicted of heresy in Rome, punishment only exile and prohibition from preaching his doctrines. Paulnitz contrasts this with Protestant countries' likely harsher penalties. Concludes the outcry against Roman Inquisition is unfounded for those behaving quietly and respectfully.
So, to wrap this all up, we have taken an incredibly detailed look into Joseph de Maistre's defense of the Spanish Inquisition.
A really comprehensive dive, yes.
Yeah.
We've meticulously gone through his core arguments, its royal nature, the limited role of churchmen in death sentences, its function in maintaining order in Spain,
and his constant pushback against accusations of cruelty, arguing they were exaggerated, especially compared to other places like England.
It's absolutely vital, though, for you, the listener, to remember this is one specific viewpoint, deeply shaped by Maistre's own reactionary convictions and his goal of countering the anti-Catholic views of his time.
Absolutely. We definitely encourage you to explore other historical accounts, other interpretations of the Inquisition to get a fuller, more nuanced picture. Such a complex and, well, highly controversial institution.
It really is.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to maybe ponder.
Yeah.
Given these complexities, these sharply conflicting stories surrounding things like the Inquisition, how do we best evaluate and understand such institutions? How do we navigate these historical complexities across different eras through these very varied perspectives without falling into overly simplistic judgments?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is. Thank you for joining us on this truly thorough examination.